So I've had this A6400 for about 300 days now, give or take a little bit, and since then I think I've given it a pretty fair chance to show me its potential. Also, this isn't an in-depth review, because if it was, I think we would be here for a solid 30 minutes. More so, I just kind of want to give an insight of what I think. So I actually started out on a slightly older model Canon called the 100D. Or for the American folk, it would be called the SL1. Now don't get me wrong, this camera really took me places and opened up my eyes to all of the possibilities it brought with it. However, something that I really struggled with was the autofocus. While it has been fairly accurate, the 100D simply did not have the capabilities of more modern cameras with rich AI features and, most importantly, continuous autofocus. Of course, the A6400 did. From the amazing colors to the incredible autofocus, this camera has been really astounding for me to use. Of course, there have been some ups and downs as with any other camera, but honestly, the negatives don't outweigh the positives this time around. Like I mentioned earlier, what stood out the most to me about the A6400 was the autofocus. I'm sorry, I'm probably about to sound like a commercial, but I just really think that it's underappreciated. And so of course, no, I'm not being paid to say any of this, and this video isn't sponsored by Sony, sadly. But I can't say this often. However, this time around, it is just as Sony advertised. I don't think I've really even had a moment in normal or low light conditions where the camera started to hunt for focus. And just like Sony says, 0.2 seconds is just about all the waiting I ever have to do. Everything has felt super responsive, and the tracking capabilities are way beyond whatever I imagined. But as I said, this is not an ad. Now, depending on the person, this may or may not be a problem, but unfortunately this camera does not support dual SD card slots. It's never really been an issue for me, but obviously SD cards do fail, so kind of take that with a grain of salt. So if you're shooting professionally or just run into a lot of once-in-a-lifetime scenes, then maybe just take that into consideration. On the other hand, I was actually really surprised by the battery life. Sony actually managed to pack a pretty decent battery into the A6400. It's not a huge camera, and I mean that in the best way possible. You don't get that fatigue that something from maybe the 5D series that Canon has would bring you, where just dragging it around in your hand gets really tiring after a while, especially if you have one of those big battery packs on the bottom. It gets really exhausting. Now, unfortunately, the screen on the A6400 is not fully articulating. However, it does have a pretty decent flip out screen, which was a huge help for me when I started doing video. As for low light capability, I would say the ISO performance is actually pretty good. This is obviously a crop sensor camera, but you can get away with some really clean images up until maybe 6400 was where I would typically draw the line before maybe I have to do something like AID noise. Now don't get me wrong, I've done shoots with this camera where I've gone and reached way above 12,800 ISO, and it was still very much usable. And of course with Lightroom AID noise, anything is possible. Anyway, something that I really actually love about this camera is the FPS it can shoot at. I really feel like there should be a better word for that than FPS, because FPS just makes me feel like I'm talking about video. Photos per second just doesn't have that same ring to it, don't you think? Anyhow, I digress. So the A6400 can go up to 11 frames per second when shooting in a photo mode, and a very solid 100 FPS if you're shooting 1080p HD in video. As for 4K footage, you have a pretty standard 24 FPS, aka the cinematic standard. Now, if I could add one thing to this camera, just one, it would definitely be 4K 60 FPS footage, but that's just me being really picky about my slow-mo footage. On top of everything else, since this is a Sony camera we're talking about, the lens selection is huge. The A6400 is a Sony E-mount camera, and is also compatible with FE mount lenses. However, they will be cropped down as it is an APS-C camera. If I were to give some recommendations on lens choices, then most likely the best option would be official Sony lenses. However, some great third-party choices could be Tamron, Sigma, Samyang. I know there's some cool choices from 7 Artisans. And of course, this is all my personal opinion, but if you're aiming for the best quality without any kind of budget, then the Sony GM line is probably what you're looking for. However, be sure to do your own research to really find what suits your needs specifically. So all in all, would I recommend buying this camera in 2025? Yes, and definitely, especially if it's your first camera or your first upgrade. Now obviously, if you can and are willing to dish out a bit more money, well, more than a bit more money, the A6700 or the A7 Mark III will definitely provide you with even more performance. However, I'm not here to sell you on a product, as I said earlier. As for Canon options, I'm not much of an expert, but at a similar price point as the A6400, I think that the Canon EOS RP is a great option. So yeah, I would definitely say that the A6400 is a solid camera option for any skill level and is definitely worth checking out. Of course, if you have any more questions, leave a comment down below and I'll try my best to answer as many of them as I can. But for now, go make something that matters.